Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. at the Center for a New American Security's annual conference. This year, the topic is Navigating the Divide in National Security. And we have with us Dr. Jerry Hendrix, who follows all manner of national security issues, particularly anything that deals with naval and air forces, but also you dabble in strategy a little bit. Jerry, I think it's safe to say?
Yes, I do. And it's enjoyable to have the range that CNAS provides for us to look at a number of different topics.
And you did that tremendous report on carriers and why super carriers are super carriers is for a lot of long-range aviation. I know that's been a consistent theme. You worked for Andy Marshall, where range and payload mattered to you over at the Office of Net Assessment when you were in uniform. And I want to ask you about your newest work. You just released it, Higher, Heavier, Farther, and Now Undetectable Bombers, Long-Range Force Projection in the 21st Century. And it's not just because you couldn't decide what the focus of the topic was. Talk to us a little bit about sort of the fundamental premise of your report.
Well, the one thing that comes back is actually it's an extension of that earlier report that we did, Retreat from Range, which looked at the carrier air wing and its evolution over time. And I wanted to look at what happened with the Air Force and how did they evolve to take on the long-range deep strike mission. And so we began historically, as almost everything that I do is, looking at the development of the bomber from World War I and then tracking it forward and seeing the emergence of the key characteristics that are associated with the bomber, starting with range and then looking at payload, then looking at altitude as well as its airspeed, and then ultimately looking at the stealth characteristics that emerged during the last two generations that all have combined in what we expect will form the B-21 Raider bomber as it emerges in the next decade.
I think it's very difficult for folks to understand that the B-52 was very much shaped by World War II. The requirement that came out in the late 1940s was shaped by the emerging Cold War, but also by World War II requirements. First flight of that jet was in 1952, last deliveries in 1960, and it will remain in the inventory for many more decades to come. And then you had the two Cold War bombers that were developed that are still currently in the inventory, and that was the B-1 bomber as well as the B-2. The B-21 is the latest iteration. It's the first post-war bomber, post-Cold War bomber that the United States has developed. Talk to us a little bit about whether or not that aircraft, I mean, there has been some criticism that too many trade-offs were made, that it won't have the range, it won't have the persistence. What did some of your research determine on that aircraft and that program?
Well, we do see that we don't expect, because the characteristics of the B-21 have not been defined publicly, but in looking at the trend analysis over the last three generations of aircraft, the B-52, the B-1, and the B-2, is that we find that some of that longer range isn't exactly as necessary because we have things like tankers to be able to support the aircraft so that we push it out so far, but then refuel it to be able to give it an on-station endurance. And we've had B-2s that have flown 40-hour missions, essentially hitting the tanker. So the idea of having what it can do on its internal fuel isn't as necessary when you look at the overall infrastructure. So we've factored those characteristics in to give our forecast of what we think that the B-21. And when I say that, this paper is written along with my co-author, which was this year's Air Force Military Fellow at the Center for New American Security, Lieutenant Colonel James Price, who actually is a bomber pilot, B-52 and B-2 rated. And so we were able to gain from his experience of having actually flown the missions as well as my historical research. So there's characteristics, altitude, it's not going to have to fly as high as some in the past. Its stealthiness, I think, is actually going to be a return to some of the characteristics that were originally going to be with the B-2 and then they moved away from in some ways. And then the idea of its carriage capacity also is a compromise between different things. It's going to have enough ordnance on board, but you don't need as much as you had in the past now that we have precision strike weapons.
And what are the kind of weapons that need to come off that? That's something you also spend quite a lot of time thinking about, is the kind of payloads and the kind of munitions that ought to be delivered from these platforms. What are some of the systems that need to be deployed from this that go beyond sort of gravity bombs or what's in the existing inventory?
Well, you do have gravity bombs, but you have the new glide bombs, you have the short-range powered bombs, you have long-range cruise missiles that can come off of this, and then you're going to have a new generation of weapons that we're just beginning to see emerge, micro-munitions, things that deal with directed energy, things that deal with electromagnetics, and even probably a new generation of hypersonic missiles. This aircraft is built not only for the current generation of weapons, but also we expect that it will be integrated to be able to accept future generations of weapons. And much the same as what we've seen the evolution of the B-52 over time, we expect the B-21 to be evolvable as well.
Do you have a sense on what the right number is? That's a big debate in Air Force circles. Dr. Carter, at the launch of the program, made abundantly clear, hey, look, if you guys can cut the price, you can get more of them. You can't control the price, you're going to get fewer of them. From your standpoint, what's the right number of these aircraft for the strategic needs of the country?
Yeah, in my analysis, I wanted to avoid the idea of sort of the market cap on this is the amount of money that we have to spend, so we have to buy within that, and actually look at what the operational requirement would be. And in looking at that, we have come up with a number of around 164 aircraft is what we think should be the minimum buy in order to get not only a sustainable operational combat coded force, but then also a training force and a resupply, a replacement force that comes on top of that. So I think 164 is your minimum requirement. And then also you're going to have to still have a background inventory of B-52s and B-2s that will be there as well.
And so what is your optimal? So you said what the minimum number is. What's the optimal number?
Well, actually, the optimal number, depending on what campaign you're looking at, you would want to have a total inventory, and that's why you have to take B-52s and B-2s into it, that you're looking in excess of 200 aircraft.
Going to the support infrastructure piece of it, the KC-135 fleet was developed to basically support the vast B-52 fleet at the time. The jet, it was the Stratofortress and the Stratotanker, which were very, very 1950s names for these platforms, but the KC-135 is going to remain in service for quite some time until it's replaced by the KC-46, which is also by Boeing. Is there, folks have a tendency, you mentioned tanking about range extension, but at some point does the Air Force get into trouble with a tanker force that's that aged, that's that old, in order to be able to support some of these frontline bomber aircraft? You
need to be able to modernize and keep your tanker force up. The tanker force is integral to the whole bomber strategy, and the ability to resupply these things in stride, which is to say to have a tanker that has the same type of altitude characteristics as well as airspeed characteristics in order for the bomber not to have come off its altitude or off its airspeed in order to hit that tanker and fully refuel it. And depending on the size of the tanker or the bomber element that's going forward, then you need to have a commensurate tanker support infrastructure there. So that's a constant balance that the Air Force is going to have to look at to assure that it has the proper support logistics infrastructure to go along with its operational strike force.
And in terms of sponsors for the report, who were some of the sponsors of the report?
The report was not a directed study per se. We're supported by a number of different sponsors, from private individuals to industry, as well as the U.S. government. In this case, we drew largely from funds supplied by industry partners, but not one in particular.
And your name continues to be mentioned for jobs in the Pentagon at some point. Is there anything to announce at this point?
Nothing to announce. I spent 26 years in the Navy. I'm pleased to serve the country if called upon, but at this point in time, happy with where I'm at and continue to do this type of thought process to try and contribute ideas to our national security debate.
Jerry, thanks very, very much, and look forward to reading the report. Thank you.
Thank you.